Great, thanks. Okay, welcome everyone to our November briefing. I'm Erica Edelson. I'm a Ruby co-founder and the communications director. I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our guest speaker. William Marble is a political scientist at the University of Pennsylvania's Program for Opinion Research and Election Studies, and he's an elections analyst at the NBC News Decision Desk. And he's going to talk to us today about a couple of recent papers that he's published. One is an analysis of the role that racial resentment played in white support for Trump, white voters' support for Trump. And the second paper looks at education polarization and whether it's cultural and/or economic issues that are driving the voting behavior of white college and non-college voters. So these are, of course, are really important and unsettled questions as we head into the next election. Especially in rural races where we know that rural voters are on the whole more socially and culturally conservative, but we also know that that does not mean that we should be writing off those voters or those races. So it's really important for us to get better at understanding what motivates working class voters, and being able to differentiate between who's reachable and who's not. So we're really happy to have Will here with us today to share some of his recent findings. Thank you so much for being here, Will, and I'll let you go ahead.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you to everybody at the Ruby group for having me here. I'm solidly on the urban side of the bridge, so I'm very excited to hear all of your feedback on some of this work. So I'm going to focus most of my presentation on understanding this educational polarization that Erica just talked about. So most of the findings are drawn from this paper on educational polarization among white voters. So I'm going to start with what is becoming now a pretty well-known phenomenon, that there's a pretty dramatic realignment going on in American politics, whereby college-educated voters are increasingly voting for Democrats, whereas voters without a college degree are shifting toward the Republican Party, away from the Democratic Party. And this trend has certainly accelerated in recent presidential elections, the Trump elections in particular, but it's the continuation of a long-running trend that really began around the year 2000. So I'm going to show you a lot of data here. I'm going to do my best to talk everything and make it as digestible as possible. So let's start here. So what I'm plotting here is just this pattern that I just discussed. And on the y-axis here, we have Republican vote share. On the x-axis is time, obviously. And the dotted line shows the Republican vote share among white voters with a college degree. And the black line shows Republican vote share among white voters without a college degree. And you see that these two lines kind of moved in tandem and weren't all that different from each other from the 1980s through around 2000. But since then, we've seen a pretty dramatic divergence where white voters are now solidly voting for Democrats, and white voters without a college degree are solidly voting for Republicans. And like I said, this is a trend that has gotten a lot of discussion in the Trump era, but you can see that it really starts well before Trump, going back to the 2000, 2004 elections, where you start to see this trend, this divergence emerge. So what I'm going to talk about here is the issue basis of this educational realignment. I'm going to take a relatively long-run, data-driven perspective on this question, covering that time range that I just showed you, 1984 through the present. And what I'm going to do here is I'll measure public opinion on some of the major policy domains in American politics, and try to measure how important these different issue attitudes are to voters' decision. And in particular, I'm going to try to decompose the attitudes where I'm going to try to distinguish between attitudes among white voters with and without a four-year college degree. In some cases, I'll use the term working class as a rough shorthand for those without a college degree, with all of the caveats that come along with that. That obviously not everybody without a college degree is working class, but by and large, I think it's a convenient measure that we have, education, to capture class divisions. So what am I going to try to convince you of or tell you in this talk? The main findings are that both economic and cultural issues play a role in this realignment, but they do so in slightly different ways. So first, I'm going to present three main findings. First, I'll show you that whites without a college degree have long been more conservative on cultural issues related to race and moral values. Second, I'll show you that college-educated white voters have recently become more liberal on economic issues. And this is kind of surprising. We typically think of college-educated voters as more conservative on economic issues, but this has changed, really flipped in recent years, which is, has led to consistent polarization across education lines on a bunch of different issues. And then third, I'll show you that cultural issues have risen in importance for whites without a college degree, which has activated their conservative cultural values. So it used to be the case that conservative cultural attitudes did not lead to all that much support for Republicans because these weren't good predictors of who people voted for. But recently that has changed quite a bit. So these three facts together help explain this realignment that we have observed along educational lines. So as I said, these findings are drawn from my paper, What Explains Educational Polarization Among White Voters. After presenting these main findings, I'll talk a little bit not just about the education gap, but also the urban-rural divide. So the basic methodology that I used here is I gathered a bunch of survey data. So I looked at dozens of survey questions that have been asked in long-running political science surveys going back to 1984. And for each of these questions, I coded whether it fell into one of four issue areas, namely economic policy, moral or social values, racial issues and civil rights, and finally, foreign policy. I won't discuss foreign policy too much today, but I'll discuss the other three categories of issues in more detail in a second. So after categorizing all of these survey questions, what I do is I use the answers to these survey questions to generate an overall ideology score for every survey respondent, close to 1 million in my entire data set, to try to understand in broad strokes what are the issue attitudes of voters over the past 40 or so years. So I'm going to measure trends in educational polarization along these issue domains and then study how they translate to vote choice. So to get a feel for what actually goes into these scales that I'm going to rely on through most of the talk, when I'm talking about economic policy, most of the questions related to economic policy that I draw from are related to spending, government spending on social services, things like welfare, healthcare, schools, and childcare. In addition, a lot of survey questions measure respondents, the public's attitude on health insurance provided by the government. Then there's some general questions about orientation toward economic policy, such as how important it is for the government to ensure that everybody has an equal opportunity, and then some more specific things like minimum wage. When I talk about moral or social values, this is a category that is related to things like LGBT rights, things like gay marriage, don't ask, don't tell. It also includes questions, especially further back in time, on gender roles, what the role of women in the workplace, for instance, as well as things like abortion and school prayer. So these general kind of moral values and social issues. And then finally, when I'm talking about racial issues or civil rights, some of the items that go into this include the public's attitude toward affirmative action, a host of questions that political scientists call racial resentment. So an example of this question is people's agreement with the statement that certain stigmatized groups in the past, such as the Irish and Jewish people, worked their way up without government favors, and Blacks should do the same. That's an example of a racial resentment question that gets put in this racial issue scale. So with that said, I'm going to use a statistical model basically to combine these survey responses into a single ideology score that's comparable over time. And the way that you should read this is that higher values on this scale indicate more conservative attitudes. So as a quick example, here I'm plotting the overall ideology on economic policy by party over time. So you can see in this red line at the top, you see some fluctuations. This is Republicans' average score on this economic policy scale. And the blue line at the bottom is Democrats' average score on this economic policy scale. So with that introduction, I'm going to move into some of the findings. What do I get from doing this exercise of coding all of these survey questions together? So the first finding that I'm going to show you is that there are long-standing educational polarization on cultural issues, by which I mean moral and social values and race and civil rights. So the question I have is how much polarization is there on these issues and whether it has changed over time. And as some historical context for thinking through how this could matter for explaining educational realignment, we can go all the way back to the New Deal era, where Democrats assembled a cross-racial coalition on the basis of redistribution, but at the cost of suppressing racial and civil rights issues. Obviously, as the civil rights era began in the 1950s and 1960s, this kicked off a long realignment along racial issues, where the political parties began to stake out different positions on racial issues. And then a little bit more recently, we've seen that moral and social value issues have really started to come to the fore in the 1970s, as there was conservative backlash to Supreme Court rulings over abortion, school prayer, and so on. And as we all know, race and identity are especially salient now in the Trump era. So the question is, how much polarization is there, and has it changed over time between the white working class and white voters' degree? And what I find is that there has long been polarization over this issue, with college-educated white voters being more liberal on both moral values issues and racial issues, going back at least to 1984. So the way that you should read this sort of graph, and I'll show you a few of them, is that these points here tell you what the average difference is between college-educated and non-college educated voters on this moral values ideology scale. So values below 0 on the y-axis tell you that college-educated voters are more liberal than non-college educated voters on this issue domain. And values above 0 would tell you the converse. And what I find here is that on moral values going back at least to 1984, there is a big difference between white voters' attitudes with and without a college degree. And we see that this hasn't changed all that dramatically over the course of the past 40 years or so. So we've seen that for a long time, college-educated voters have been more liberal on these moral values issues, which raises the question of how much they can explain, how much these sorts of issues can explain the realignment that we've seen. And I'll come back to this question later. We see a relatively similar pattern when looking at racial issues here. We see that for at least since 1984, college-educated white voters have been more liberal on racial issues than voters without a college degree. And this has fluctuated a little bit over time, but the general trend is relatively flat, with maybe some indication that in the Trump era, going all the way up to 2020, we may be seeing even widening divides along this racial and civil rights issue dimension. So summing up here, this first finding is that the white working class has long been more conservative on these cultural issues. The second finding that I want to show you is something maybe a little bit more. As Erica mentioned in the beginning, we already had this notion that many working class voters tend to be slightly more culturally conservative. But what I'm finding is that there's increasing economic liberalism among college graduates as well. And this is a little bit more surprising. The reason is that theoretically, we would expect poorer people to have more to gain from redistribution and social insurance, these sort of core economic policy issues. And we know from the economics work in economics that the college wage premium is now near an all-time high, meaning college graduates are earning more money than those without a college degree than they ever have going back 50 years or so. So we might expect college grads to be especially conservative given that, because they're doing much better than people without a college degree. Which raises the question of how we can square this intuition with the educational realignment that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. And it turns out that what I find is that college graduates are becoming more liberal on economic policy than the working class. And this is somewhat surprising. So you see the trend here, going back to 1984 to 2000, we saw that there were pretty minimal differences actually on economic policy. So these results are controlling for age, race, gender, and income. So once we see that, people with and without a college degree had relative policy preferences on economic policy. But this started to change around 2004 and then accelerated in 2008, 2012, and the following elections to the extent, to the point where we now see very consistent polarization across educational groups on economic policy, just as we have seen previously that there is consistent polarization on cultural issues as well. So you might ask, is this some kind of weird artifact of me combining together a bunch of survey questions? And you might rightly think that some questions related to economic policy might have different dynamics. So this next plot, there's a lot here, but what I want to highlight here is this is the difference between college and non-college educated voters on a bunch of individual questions related to economic policy. And so these questions range from government health insurance preferences for spending on government health insurance to spending on welfare, spending on a whole lot of things here. And what you see is that, like I suggested, there is some variation where, for instance, this light green dot here is spending on Social Security, and people without a college degree prefer much more spending on Social Security than people with a college degree, and that's pretty consistent over time. But overall, the trend on a lot of these spending items is that college-educated voters are becoming increasingly supportive of government spending than those without a college degree.
Will, can I interject one
Yes.
question from the chat? Just to clarify, the vertical line, does that represent the range of responses?
Oh, the vertical line here tells you basically on each dot tells you it's a confidence interval. What this means, it's a measure of how sure we are that the difference is a real difference compared to just a statistical fluke, basically. So when we see, for instance, that in this green, light green set of dots at the top here, if this line extended all the way down towards 0, then we wouldn't really be very confident that there was a difference between college and non-college voters. It could just be due to a statistical fluke. But because it's not overlapping zero, we have some confidence that this is a real difference that we're picking up.
Okay, and then a related question, in terms of interpreting this chart, like how do we know to what degree the divergence is a function of college educators, voters becoming more liberal versus non-college educated voters becoming more conservative? Does this chart reflect that distinction?
This chart does not reflect that distinction. So what I'm just plotting here is the difference. So this is a good question and gets at the idea that it could be that college educated voters are getting more liberal, or it could be that non-college voters are getting more conservative. I don't have a graph to show you that exactly distinguish between them, but it turns out to be kind of a combination of both of these factors at play. Thank you for those clarifying questions. I told Erica and the rest of the team beforehand that if you have some clarifying questions, I'm happy to answer them to make sure that everybody's on the same page to the extent possible. Okay, so summing up the first two findings. First, I showed you that college-educated voters have long been more liberal on cultural issues, and that recently they have become more liberal on economic issues as well. So the third thing that I'm going to try to show you is that there is an increasing importance of cultural issues for vote choice among the working class. So what I showed you is just changes in stability in issue attitudes and divergence across class groups. But I haven't told you how important these attitudes are for the decisions that people make in the voting booth. And in order to do that, we need to basically look at the correlation between people's attitudes and how they choose to vote in each election. And so what I'm going to do here is I will compare how well these issue attitudes predict vote choice among those with and without a college degree. And this allows me to estimate the relative issue weight between educational groups. And what I mean by this is a measure of how important each issue is for non-college graduates relative to college graduates. So this measure, for instance, if it were zero, it would tell me that some particular issue is not at all important for those without a college degree, but it is important for those with a college degree. If it's one, then it tells me that this issue matters just as much for those with a college degree as those without a college degree. And this will allow us to get a sense of how important these different issues are for these two groups and understand whether some issues are more important for the working class than for college educated voters. And so what I find here is that there's an increasing convergence in the issue weights. So again, there's a lot on this graph, so I'm going to walk you through it. So each panel here represents one of these four issue domains. Again, I'll just focus on the first three here. On the y-axis is this relative issue weight that I said if it's zero, it means that college-educated voters care about this issue, whereas non-college voters don't. If it's one, it means these two groups care about this issue in exactly the same amount. And so what I want to highlight is mostly on moral and social issues and race and civil rights. So because these dots for many years were below one, what this indicates is that moral and social values were less predictive of vote choice for the working class than for those with a college degree. So for a long time here, even though the working class is more conservative on moral and social issues and race and civil rights, it didn't translate that heavily to Republican voting. In contrast, those with a college degree did seem to vote based on these cultural issues. But what I want to highlight is at the end of this time series here, basically from 2008 to 2020, where we see that this line has snapped almost exactly to one for both moral and social values and for race and civil rights. And what that means is that now both college-educated voters and non-college educated voters are basing their vote choice on their cultural values, their ideology on moral and social issues, and their attitudes towards race and civil rights. At the same time, we see that economics is also becoming slightly more important for non-college voters as well. So to the extent that we now see that non-college voters are expressing somewhat more conservative attitudes on economic issues, this means that that's pushing them towards Republicans as well. So let's try to put these three findings together and try to think through what this means for politics more broadly. And a nice touch point on this, maybe a book that you're familiar with from about almost 20 years ago now, that was kind of condescendingly titled, "What's the Matter with Kansas?" And this journalist, Thomas Frank, made this argument that voters, basically poor voters, rural voters, were voting for Republicans due to abortion, gay rights, and things like that. This sparked a lot of debate in the political science literature. A good example here is this Larry Bartels called "What's the Matter with Kansas?" And what was found at that time is that upon closer analysis was that it was really richer people, college-educated people, who cared about these social issues and moral values issues like abortion and gay rights, and that once you looked at the data a little bit more closely, it didn't seem like poorer people were being quote unquote tricked into voting for Republicans, which was the sort of one-line takeaway from "What's the Matter with Kansas?" But what's happened since then throws that pushback to "What's the Matter with Kansas?" into question. So what I found here is a few things. First, on economic policy, I find that white college graduates have become increasingly liberal on economic issues, which has the effect of pushing them toward the Democratic Party. And then when it comes to cultural issues, these "what's the matter with Kansas" type issues, we see that white voters without a college degree have always, or at least since 1984, they have always been more culturally conservative on racial issues and on cultural issues related to gay marriage, abortion, and things like that. But it didn't translate into high rates of support for Republicans, in part because these issues just mattered more for those with a college degree. And that was the consensus after this "What's the Matter with Kansas" debate happened around 2006. But it happened at kind of an inopportune time, because when we extend the analysis through 2020, what we find is that these cultural attitudes now are kind of equally important among many different groups of voters in the electorate. So cultural attitudes are now predicting vote choice among both white voters with and without a college degree. So in some sense, these conservative cultural attitudes of the white working class have been activated and are now meant in vote choice than they used to be. So that's the big takeaway from this paper that I have walked you through here, is that both economic policy and cultural issues are important for explaining educational realignment. So we can come back to that. I'm happy to take questions about that, but I did want to do a little bit more analysis about not just looking at educational groups, but also looking at the urban-rural divide by the issues. And so this is a graph that shows you the relationship between vote choice in presidential elections, or vote share in presidential elections, and population density. I've taken from Jonathan Roden. And I'm sure this is not news to any of the audience here, that a strong predictor of election outcomes is population density, where cities vote overwhelmingly at this point for Democrats, and more rural areas are voting increasingly heavily for Republicans. And so this kind of has happened, there's a long history to this urban-rural divide, obviously. But it has strengthened, at least in the past 50 years, 60 years here. You see that this relationship was much weaker in 1960 than it was in 2016. And so I wanted to apply some of the same analysis that I presented previously to the urban-rural divide. And so I'm going to ask, based on this, this measure of conservatism or ideology on these different issues, how much more conservative are rural voters across these different issues? And in order to do this, I looked at the county in which my survey respondents live, and I merged some census data in that contains the share of people in the county who live in an urban versus rural census block. So this is, it's notoriously difficult to capture urban and rural at the county level. So this is one measure. It's probably not perfect, but this is what it looks like when we look at what sort of place every survey respondent lives in. So on the x-axis is this measure of ruralness at the county level, and it's the share of the county population that lives in a rural area. On the y-axis is the share of survey respondents who live in each type of county. So what this shows you is that a lot of survey respondents here on the left-hand side live in very urban places where almost nobody in their county lives in a rural area. But then there are a lot of people who live in much more rural counties. And then a good number of people who live in counties that are all rural. So just because I wanted to show you this just to get a sense, give you a sense of what this measure is, because there are so many different ways of measuring how urban or rural a county is. So this is the urban-rural divide on these three core issues that I've talked about today. So on the x-axis here is that same measure of how urban or rural the county is, 0 being completely urban, 1 being completely rural. And on the y-axis is the average conservatism or the average ideology on each of these issues. This green line at the top is racial issues. This dotted line is, the black dotted line is moral / social issues. And this blue line is economic issues. And what I want to highlight here is that we see that people in rural areas by this measure are more conservative across all of these different domains, but this is really true on moral values issues and on racial issues, where there is some kind of urban-rural gradient on economic issues, but to a much lesser degree. And this raises the question, I think, of whether rural voters really are economically conservative. I think there's an important distinction between different types of economic policies that I've been thinking through. So I want to highlight some of this that might be useful for some of your work to think through what we mean when we say economic policy and conservative on economic policy. So in the data that I've presented you so far, this economic policy index is mostly contains questions related to government spending. But it's possible that this is hiding some heterogeneity across different types of economic policy. So it could be that more economically populist policies are more popular among rural voters than welfare or government spending policies. So some examples of what I mean by economically populist policies are things like a higher minimum wage, increased antitrust action, support of labor unions, or industrial policy that tries to onshore jobs. And these sorts of policies are I think, becoming increasingly important with the Biden administration, sort of pivoting away from the Clinton era neoliberal economic policy. So unfortunately, there's not all that much survey data in the data that I'm using. There's not that many questions that are related to some of these sorts of policies, but I will show you one comparison drawn from data from 2016 and 2020. And I'm going to compare support for a $15 minimum wage to attitudes on welfare spending to see whether this whether rural voters are actually more economically conservative on different issues. And so what I show you here is on the y-axis is opposition to welfare spending measured from 0 to 2. And on the x-axis, again, is the share of the county population living in rural areas. And what you see is that people in very urban areas are pretty significantly less opposed to spending on welfare than people in more rural areas. So on this sort of measure, when it comes to redistribution spending, it seems like there is kind of a significant urban-rural divide. I think somebody just shared their screen by accident, presumably.
Oops, yeah, Stephen Maxine, you accidentally just did a screen share. I'm not sure, I didn't even know that could happen. Okay, it looks like they stopped that, so you could reshare yours now, Will. Sorry.
Okay, can you see it again?
Yeah.
So there does seem to be this gradient, urban-rural gradient, when it comes to welfare spending. But when you look at support for a higher minimum wage, there's actually much less of a gradient, where we see that people in very urban areas support a $15 minimum wage at a rate of about 70%. And it's a bit lower for sure in more rural areas, but it never really dips below 50%. So even in the most rural areas, we still see a lot of support for this sort of economically populist type of policy, what has sometimes been termed pre-distribution sort of policy. So I think that this is kind of an important distinction that I want to sort of caveat my previous results by saying that there's a distinction between redistribution versus quote unquote pre-distribution policies that aim to alter the structure of the labor market so that the market generates more equitable outcomes rather than just taxing and money after everybody has earned what they earn in the labor market. So these sorts of policies are things like the minimum wage, job guarantees, and stronger unions. And as I mentioned before, I think these are becoming increasingly popular as the Biden administration has been pushing some of these. So that kind of concludes my discussion for today. I'm very happy to take questions about this or other sorts of questions you may have related to these issues. I listed a few sources for further reading here, some maybe kind of shameless plug for some of my work, but also some other work here that I think is really interesting and helps shed light on this realignment that we're seeing both along urban-rural lines and along educational lines. So I mentioned Jonathan Roden previously. He has a book that I think is the best treatment of this urban-rural divide thus far called Why Cities Lose. There's a very recent paper that just came out this week by some economists that tries to document different preferences for redistribution versus pre-distribution that I think is very interesting. And there's a few others on here that you may be interested in if you're looking for further reading on any of this. So thank you very much for listening and for having me here. I'm very happy to take questions about anything I talked about here or maybe speculate a little bit more if you have other questions. And feel free to get in touch with me at my email address here, marblew@upenn.edu. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Will. Why don't you stop your screen share so we can just be able to see the chat and stuff easier. Well, that was great. I mean, you managed to make a lot of wonky data really, really clear for us. So I appreciate it. It probably wasn't easy to do, but you did pull that off. So
I did my best.
Yes.
I apologize if I lost anybody there.
Yeah, well, that's what the Q&A is for. I'm going to kick off with one question, and I hope I'm not asking too much to sort of give a short sort of elevator pitch version of your other paper where you made some findings around the extent to which racial resentment was a driver that predicted voting for Trump, which kind of came as a surprise to a lot of people because prior to that, there'd been a flurry of papers kind of showing the opposite. And so I wonder if you could just say a little bit about like what you found in that paper and why you think your findings might have been different than what we'd seen before that.
Yes, so I'm going to re-screen share here and say that the paper that Erica is talking about is now called Measuring the Contribution of Voting Blocks to Election Outcomes. So something we do in this paper is we want to understand not just what leads individual people to support one candidate versus another, but we want to try to characterize who are the groups of people that are most important for election outcomes. And there has been a lot of documentation that racial attitudes, racial resentment is increasingly important in who people vote for. But we kind of turn this on its head a little bit and look to see if we were to group people based on their racial attitudes, which groups of voters were most important for putting Trump in the White House. And so what we find is kind of counterintuitive, as you just mentioned, Erica. We find that Trump did better than Romney going from 2012 to 2016. He got more votes from people at relatively low ranges of racial resentment. And the reason for this is that as Trump's kind of polarizing rhetoric, racist rhetoric, frankly, came to people's attention, a lot of people changed their attitudes and became a little bit more racially progressive. But still, a lot of these people liked Trump. So what happened was that there was an increase in the number of people at the lower levels of racial resentment. And because Trump did a little bit better among these people than Romney did, he actually gained the most votes among people with relatively low to moderate levels of racial resentment. A mixed bag if you're in the progressive camp. On the one hand, we see that there was definitely some backlash to Trump's rhetoric on racial and identity issues. On the other hand, a lot of folks who are relatively liberal on these issues were still voting for Trump. So there's more of them. At putting these two things together, there's more of them. And they voted for Trump a little bit more than they voted for Romney. And as a result, Trump actually improved the most among this group of voters.
Okay. Yeah, that is interesting. It's a lot to wrap our minds around. Thank you. Okay, let's start getting into some of the questions in the chat. And Cody, I'm going to ask for your help here in case you've been keeping a closer eye on it than I've been able to so far.
Erica, I'll jump in with one early
Thanks.
on. Was what role does religion play in this sorting? Did Will look into that at all?
Yeah, so this is lumped in a little bit. I would say, so first of all, I'll say that my approach here is to think in broad strokes, and there's a lot of nuances that I'm papering over, obviously. I'm putting together a lot of survey questions that are related to kind of some core similar ideas, survey questions that tend to go together, but every issue could have its own unique dynamics. So where I would say that religion most plays into this is the extent to which it correlates with moral and social values. So we saw, starting in the 1970s, mobilization of American evangelicals and other more conservative religious groups on the basis of abortion, and then moving forward toward gay rights and other sorts of issues like that. So those sorts of issues get grouped into the moral/social values policy domain that I discussed previously. But what I don't do in this analysis is look at different religious groups themselves. I take a more policy opinion lens to understanding this realignment rather than a social identity lens, in the sense that I'm not looking at people's social identities, which include their religion. I'm looking at their policy views, which may be correlated with their religion.
Okay. Here's one from John. He was wondering, I don't know if your paper, if your research would have touched on this, but he's suggesting that sometimes someone's well-being financially can impact their social and cultural views. So for example, someone might be like more conservative around immigration if they felt that their job was threatened by immigration. Any comment on that?
Yeah, so I can draw on other research on this. So there's research in political science and economics, both that suggests, there's a lot of competing claims, but there's some work that finds that the places that saw the most economic decline as the U.S. became more integrated into the global economy, which kind of decimated manufacturing, those sorts of places became more culturally conservative as well, especially white people in those places. So there's a few explanations for it, but I think kind of what most political scientists would think of this, think of the reason for this pattern as being related to people's loss of economic well-being, heightening sort of the advantage that white people have on in the social world. So as people are doing worse economically, they kind of hold on to what they still have, which in many cases is their white identity. So there is definitely this correlation that's been documented in a bunch of research thus far.
Okay.
So it's a very complicated, sort of interconnected set of trends that have happened. And we're really just starting, I think, to tease apart all of these different connections.
Yeah. I see some hands up, and I know for folks who have attended our briefings before, we normally do have people come off mute and speak, but we have so many questions and so many people, and the hour is growing short. So I'm going to ask that everyone just put their questions in chat this time. So Karen or Bruce, I'm not sure which, asked if you have any hypotheses about why these differences in attitudes between college and non-college exist.
Yeah, so this is a hard question, and actually something that I'm interested in working on in the future. There's a lot of different hypotheses out there. I'm going to focus mostly on economic policy here because I think it's the most counterintuitive as to why people who have college degrees seem to be more liberal on economic policy increasingly. I think there's a couple explanations. One explanation is that people who are doing better off economically, have more security in their employment situation, often live in cities, and they may be more closely exposed to the externalities of inequality. So if you live in a city with a lot of homelessness or crime, you may see this and think, well, this is too big for any one person to handle. And therefore we need some government intervention here to help people, because it's hurting me because I have to live closer to all of these negative externalities. So there's some research that suggests that explanation. I think there are some other things happening as well. So one possibility is that as the American party system has become more polarized, it could be that people identify with Democrats or Republicans based on their cultural values, and then they adopt the economic policy values of the party that they identify with. So it could be a situation where people are following political leaders here. Another explanation I want to say, I'm explaining some hypotheses here, and probably there's some truth to all of them. It's a complicated phenomenon that doesn't have a single cause. But a final thing that I'll mention, two final things that I'll mention, are related to the social structure of communities that are more densely or less densely populated. So the first thing is that if you're imagining how far government spending goes, imagine the government building a new hospital, for instance, each dollar spent is going to go a little bit farther in places that are more densely populated. So if you're in a rural area, you may very logically think that government spending on those sorts of programs just doesn't go as far as it would in cities. So that could be part of it. And then a final thing that I'll mention is that I think there's something to the social structure of different communities that influences these views as well. So I have some other work on this, but the idea that I have is that if you are living in a place that is kind of in economic decline, there's probably strong social connections keeping you there. Family, friends, community. And these sorts of informal social institutions can help cushion you if you fall on hard times in a way that people who move away for work may not have. So if you move to a different city where you don't know as many people, you may have more of a need for a government provided safety net, because if you fall on hard times, you don't have family nearby who you can rely on. So I think there's a bunch of issues that all sort of play into this. But I don't have all the answers here. I want to be clear. So I think that I would be curious to hear if other people have suggestions as well. And I will read everything in the chat after this because I see that there's a lot of discussion.
Yeah, we'll share that with you for sure. I see a bunch more, but Cody, I want to see if you have any you wanted to bring to the forefront.
Yeah, I'd like to try to combine two questions here. Oops, sorry, my chat's jumping around here. One is really about, why these patterns are happening, the reason to explain these patterns. So Monty asks, why have non-college educated whites increased the importance they attach to social/moral issues, and what is propelling this continuing increase? And to the extent, I want to combine then Scott's question with this, to the extent it's about sort of like sources of information. Scott asks, what are the major sources of social, political, economic information for rural voters that help shape their opinions on racial, moral, and economic issues? He lists newspapers, cable TV, social media mailings. Is one more dominant than the others?
Yeah, I think these are big questions that, again, I don't have all the answers to. I think in a big picture sense, why is there this increased convergence and how much these issues matter across groups? I think the information environment is a big part of it. You see, this is, I should say, speculation here, but if you look at the plots that I showed you, you see that this convergence happens kind of with the rise of a very nationalized media, a right-wing media in particular that kind of stokes culture war issues going back to 2004, 2008 or so. So there's some possibility that as people are seeing more messaging from media and political elites on these issues, they start to pay more attention to it. They start to say, like, hey, there really is a difference between politicians from the Democratic and Republican Party on these issues. And this is something that I'm told that I should care about, and I actually, in fact, do care about. So that's one possibility. I think that would be the main thing that I would say, but it kind of is not just media. It goes along with politicians also trying to campaign on these issues as well. So I mentioned kind of very briefly the historical context of these racial and moral values issues kind of waxing and waning in importance. And I think to the extent that politicians are campaigning on these issues, it leads more voters to think that these issues are important. And in particular, it may lead people who are working class whites to think they're important. Whereas college educated voters, they may have more post-materialist views where they are relatively more economically secure, which kind of affords them the luxury, so to speak, of voting on non-economic issues. But now as politicians are talking more about these issues, it could be that everybody is thinking about these issues. And I think a good example of this is the waxing and waning just in the past 20 years of how important LGBT rights are. So it seemed after the Supreme Court decisions legalizing gay marriage that this was something that Republicans realized that they kind of just weren't winning on and weren't going to be talking about very much anymore. But that's really not been the case, as we all know, in the past couple of years with these laws related to education in particular, the quote unquote "don't say gay" law in Florida. So I think we're seeing like a resurgence of these sort of moral values issues as a hotbed of political controversy.
Ace was asking a question about whether these trends you've described for white non-college voters also apply to non-college voters of color, or have they, do they continue to vote more like urban voters?
Yeah, so there's much less educational polarization among voters of color. There's a possibility that we're sort of in this situation where in the past, in 2020, there was lower vote share for Biden in 2020 than among Black voters and Hispanic voters than for Clinton in 2016. So there's a possibility that we're sort of at the beginning of a realignment along educational lines among voters of color, but I would say that these differences are much less dramatic than they are among white voters. There's much less variation in vote choice among voters of color than there is among white voters. And I would say that the approach that I take in this paper, this presentation, especially when it comes to what I labeled racial issues, doesn't make quite as much sense when applied to voters of color because of the nature of the survey questions that are asked here, where they're really questions that have been asked for decades that are really aimed at gauging whites' perceptions of race and civil rights. So it's harder for me to do the same sort of analysis among voters of color. That said, I think we're just going to have to wait and see whether we do see this educational realignment. There's little bits of evidence that we might be at the beginning of it, but we're not quite. I wouldn't say we're seeing a realignment there yet.
Okay, Cody, you want to pick our what will unfortunately have to be our last question for today?
Oh man, really putting the pressure on. There are so many good questions this time. I am tempted to.
Erica, I'm going to jump in and suggest that we go to 5 after for those who want to, so we can get 2 or 3 more questions in.
Sure. Will, are you able to do that?
Yep, that's fine with me.
Fantastic.
Well, in that case, I want to kind of do a follow-up on my last question about why this trend is changing. And Diane asked if we could please talk about the elephant in the room. In 2008, we elected the nation's first Black president. To what extent can we correlate that to some of this change?
That's an interesting question. I mean, something that always sticks out to me about the 2008 election is that Obama's rhetoric, in large part, was kind of a more economic-based rhetoric, and he kind of deliberately avoided discussing racial issues to the extent possible, obviously with some notable exceptions. And we actually, he actually won quite a lot of voters who at high levels of racial resentment, which is maybe kind of surprising, given that he was the first Black presidential candidate or first Black president. But certainly there was some backlash to his presidency. And we saw this, I think, most dramatically in the Tea Party movement, which I think is the organizational and ideological predecessor to the Freedom Caucus and kind of the more extremist right-wing elements of the Republican Party now. So there certainly is a sense that there was mobilization on these racial issues and racial attitudes as a backlash to Obama. So I think that is probably part of it. But we do see some of the we see some of, well, there's two things here. One is that these cultural issues or these racial issues have long divided college and non-college educated voters. And we see this issue convergence really pick up around 2008. So that indicates that Obama probably had something to do with it. But there's a lot of things moving at the same time. So, it's a great idea for future research that I will be writing down and trying to parse.
Okay, great. I'm just looking here. Cody, jump in if you've got something. I'm still scrolling.
I'm going to jump in while Cody's looking. Edward has asked a couple of questions and put forward sort of a hypothesis as well about part of the general movement conservatively, but specifically the kind of anti-government piece of things, is that a lot of rural people see that a lot of government programs don't really work well in their areas. Either they're not available or much harder to access, or they were designed for more of an urban or suburban group, and so they're not fitting well with rural realities, whether that's transportation issues or whatever. So do you have any evidence to kind of relate to that at all regarding whether that's contributing to the anti-government and more broadly kind of anti-elite sentiment that seems to be behind some of this?
I don't have any direct evidence of this from my own research, but I think certainly others have documented some of this, some of what you're describing. People like Kathy Kramer describing rural resentment at government just not working very well for rural voters, and rural people seeing it as the domain of people in cities. So that's one piece of it. There's another paper that I alluded to, it didn't mention specifically, by a political scientist named Theo Serlin, who kind of traces the roots of the urban-rural divide on government spending issues back to the New Deal era, and he proposes this explanation that you just mentioned here, which is that government spending just doesn't work, doesn't go as far in rural, less populated areas. I gave this example of hospitals earlier, where a hospital, there's a lot of fixed costs to build it, and it doesn't matter whether you're building it in a city or in a rural area, you still have to pay that fixed cost. But it goes a lot farther, can serve a lot more people for a single dollar in a more densely populated area. So I think that there's some very rational reasons to think that people in more rural areas shouldn't want as much government spending as people in more urban areas. So as I said, I don't have all of the answers there, but I can point you to that work as providing a partial explanation for this dynamic that you mentioned.
Great. Let's see. There's a lot of comments, and I'm not sure I've seen if there's more questions. Oh, wait a second. These others. Okay, Michael was asking, it looked from your data like social, cultural, racial, and foreign policy factors all became more activated for non-college voters after 2008. Is it possible that these voters became more energized in general, perhaps driven by the message that your country is being destroyed or invaded by others?
Yeah, that's I can tell you were paying very close attention from this question, so I really appreciate this question. Yeah, that's right, that we see kind of a convergence across a bunch of different issues here. And I do interpret that as evidence that that people's policy preferences among the working class especially are just becoming more important for their vote choice across a bunch of different issues. So there's some explanations for this, one of which you just mentioned. One explanation is this messaging, this elite messaging that, you're losing your country's being taken away from you. I think it also coincides to a great extent with the rise of social media, the rise of a lot of these nationalized media, this nationalized media ecosystem that gives people, really 24/7 access to the talking points that politicians and other elites are making at the time. So I think these two things together probably both are important. There is some evidence from the political science literature that increasingly nationalized media leads people to vote, unsurprisingly, on national issues. They care a lot less than about local issues when they're consuming Fox News as compared to their local newspaper, or when they're seeing sort of nationally syndicated local news segments on Sinclair broadcasting local affiliate stations compared to coverage that's actually related to the place that they live. So if I had to bet on what the most important explanation is, I think it's this media environment that has become hyper-partisan, hyper-polarized, and really constant throughout different parts of the country.
Yeah, and that's those things we talk a lot about that at Ruby, the collapse of local journalism, and the real partisan silos of the national media, and the prominence of the culture war on all the cable news is all driving people toward a national orientation and away from a local orientation, and just not enough not enough local organizing going on that would give people an outlet to be focusing on their local issues instead of the national. So those are all really big themes with us here that we're trying to address. Yeah, well, any final thoughts, and then I think we'll come to a close.
Yeah, I think first of all, thank you everyone for listening here. I'm really looking forward to reading all your comments. And I think there's just a lot of open questions here, and I did my best here to describe some of the trends that I found. But as we've touched on, there's a lot of unanswered questions and I think you're all sort of honing in on exactly the right ones that I hope to investigate in the future. So thanks for all the work you do, and thanks for having me.
Well, thank you again so much. And folks, next month, coincidentally, Will had talked about Thomas Frank's book, What's the Matter with Kansas? And he is, in fact, our speaker next month for our briefing, not talking about that book, but he's going to be giving us a little history of progressive populism. So he's very engaging. It's been around a long time, and I'm sure it'll be a great talk. So I hope you can all come back for that. Thanks for being here. Thanks once again to Will, and have a great month, everyone.